All right, welcome everybody. This is History 2050, Race Ethnicity, right? And we are in spring 2021, and we are just so excited to be here. This is our final presentations. We have been examining so many different important topics relevant to our society, relevant to what's been happening in our lives, right? And we've been looking at different kinds of issues. And we've broken up, for our final presentations, we've broken it up into 5 different main groups, right? We have our Native American group, we have our African American group, we have our Caucasian American group, we have our Asian American group, and we have our Chicanx-Latinx American group, right? And we've kind of broken it up for a reason, right? We said we wanted to approach it from the lens of what are the experiences that these different groups have been going through, right? And so what you're gonna see are group presentations by folks who want to highlight certain key points that they find important for us to know. Some students will be connecting it, right, to resistance and power structures, right? Other students will be highlighting, right, different kinds of themes and topics that we've been looking at in the textbooks, right? We also will be including oral history testimonies from our individual projects and that we contributed to the archive in history, right? And each group will be presenting a cultural product, right? Some piece that expresses culture, and it could be something emerging from their experiences, from testimonials, films or poems, advertisements, etc. And so that being said, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our first group, which is the Native American group. Welcome. Let's give snaps, applause, all that good stuff. Welcome.
Hello, this is a presentation on Native American history in the United States. In this presentation, we will discuss the stolen land from Indigenous people, the Native American boarding schools, the events of Wounded Knee in both 1890 and 1973, the Indian Reorganization Act, the modern-day discrimination of Indigenous people, and our cultural product.
European settlers in America were driven by the concept of manifest destiny to expand westward. In doing so, they forced Native Americans out of their sacred homelands. Under the 1830 Indian Removal Act, all Cherokee land was to be ceded to the United States government, while the Cherokee people themselves were to be relocated to Indian Territory. The forcing of Indigenous peoples off their land was not only experienced by the Cherokee Nation, but many other tribes too. The Dawes and Curtis Acts forced some Native tribes to cede significant portions of their land to the government. This land was then privatized and sold.
The U.S. government and American settlers constantly stole Indigenous land. One example was the Black Hills, which are sacred to the Sioux nations. Gold was found in the Black Hills, causing prospectors and soldiers to invade the lands and drive the Native Americans out. Part of the Black Hills later became Mount Rushmore. The Supreme Court case, United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians in 1980, ruled that compensation should be given to the Sioux, but not the land. As of today, the amount has gained interest and is valued at over $1.3 billion, but they have not accepted it because it would validate the theft of the indigenous land. The Blue Lake in New Mexico is sacred to the Teos Pueblo Indians, but the land was taken from them in 1906 and turned into a park filled with tours and campgrounds. That land was finally returned to them in 1970. The Grand Canyon Skywalk, pictured here, was built on land sacred to the Havasupai Nation, and after a few legal battles, administration of the Grand Canyon National Park was partially restored to the Havasupai Nation. Native American boarding schools were designed to Americanize Native American children. The children were taken away from their parents, put in a dungeon for a short time, and then were stripped of their identities, culture, and way of life. They had their clothes taken away, their hair was cut, they were dressed in uniforms and treated like soldiers, and they were beaten if they spoke their own language. The primary goal was to assimilate the indigenous children, or in other words, kill the Indian and save them.
The treatment of Native American women was very different between the indigenous people and the European settlers. In Native American nations such as the Cherokee, women were occasionally involved in politics. Different nations had women select representatives for governing councils. The European settlers captured and sexually assaulted Native American women. Stories were passed down of Indigenous women forced to sleep with the soldiers for food on reservations. Armed soldiers have attacked unarmed Indigenous women and children, which was not an uncommon occurrence, at a river fish-in protesting for fishing rights for Native Americans in 1965. The events at Wounded Knee, both in 1890 and 1973, were very significant in Native American history in the United States. In 1890, a cavalry attack on unarmed and sick Lakota refugees at Wounded Knee killed 300 Indigenous people. In 1973, Native American protesters remained at Wounded Knee to take action against the mismanagement of the Sioux Reservation. The protest was surrounded by the military, and many Lakota women had to travel through snipers and helicopters to get supplies for the stand against the violence of the government against the Sioux.
The Indian New Deal of 1934 helped protect lands as well as restore them. The Indian New Deal also provided more educational opportunities. A program that was part of the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps. The program provided single men with jobs, housing, and food. The jobs they had were to better public parks, forests, and lands. Men also had education opportunities as well as being able to have a higher position. The Indian New Deal helped better Indian reservations such as hospitals, schools, roads, etc. Wowoka, who was a shaman of the Northern Paiute tribe, had a vision during solar eclipse that occurred on January 1st, 1889. The ghost dance was founded by Wowoka as a spiritual movement. Based on his teachings, the ceremony would bring the spirits of the dead and the living together, and they would have enough power and strength to go against the white settlers. The American Indian movement was founded in 1968. At first, the movement was made in order to help out Native Americans who were recently urbanized. It then branched out in order to give Native Americans their land back and their treaty rights. The American Indian movement helped establish the Legal Rights Center, which gave the poor free representation. They also helped establish the Indian Health Board, which provided Native-centric medical care. The longest walk took place in 1978. Hundreds of natives walked from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. The purpose of the walk was to protest the imprisonment of the AIM activist Leonard Peltier, as well as 11 federal bills that were a danger to treaty rights. The walk also helped lift the ban on Native American spiritual practices.
Many Native Americans have had it very difficult for them, starting with how many of them live in reservations that often offer very little opportunity for success, since many reservations are in what many would call ruins, as well as Native Americans having the highest unemployment group, as well as living in poverty. And in addition, a quarter of Native America, the Native American population are binge drinkers, which is more likely that younger Native Americans will become alcoholics at a young age, as well as many Native Americans in these reservations not having the proper education due to the fact that many of those schools are heavily underfunded, as well as living in a unstable housing system due to the fact that there's hardly any jobs within their reservations, and their native language is almost extinct due to the fact that many of them don't practice their traditional cultures or beliefs. And a quote by Dunbar's book, said by Jody Bride, says, "The story of the New World is horror. The story of America is a crime," basically implying that America itself is a crime due to the fact that many of the settlers forcefully took away the lands of the natives, and therefore causing what some would call a genocide, and therefore making this new world.
The cultural product is supposed to represent life before and after colonization. The silhouette is that of a Native American. The smoke is supposed to represent that of the smoke from the guns being fired. The red on the feather of the silhouette represents the blood of those of lives lost. The skull represents the boarding schools children were sent to that stripped them of their identity. The plants represent agriculture, and the turkey represents a popular myth surrounding Thanksgiving, but in reality, Native Americans were slaughtered. The mountains represent Mount Rushmore and other sacred lands that were taken away from Native Americans and turned into national landmarks, private property, and real estates. The dollar sign represents the profit off of the lands taken away from natives. Our group chose to make this cultural product because it showed the identity of Native Americans being covered up.
My name is Cliff Connors, and I interviewed my grandmother about her experience of sexism as a member of the silent generation for my oral history.
My name is Tabitha Cruz, and I interviewed my mother about crossing the Mexico-United States border.
My name is Alberto Colon. I interviewed my mother about crossing the Mexico-United States border.
My name is Lani Hansel, and I interviewed my mother about breaking away from toxic relationships.
My name is Maylee Lazaro, and I interviewed my mother about feeling like a stranger going back to a country she knew nothing about from my oral history.
My name is Caitlin John, and I interviewed my grandmother about the sexism she faced when going to college and becoming an architect.
All right, my goodness, what a bar that's set high. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Snaps, all that good stuff. Wonderful, wonderful work. Beautiful, beautiful work. Thank you so much. I mean, we learned so much and we've seen so much. So thanks again. Wow, just wonderful. I'm blown away. All right, let's hop into our next group, which is the African American group. Are we ready?
Hi, so this is our presentation where we'll be looking at some eras in the United States through the lens of African Americans.
So for the pre-Civil War era, slavery has been around for some time now, dating back to the events of the transatlantic trade, which happened during the 16th century, all throughout the 19th century, with many enslaved African people being shipped out to several parts of America. As years went by, African American slaves had begun to rebel against the oppressive state slave system, most notably Nat Turner's Rebellion, which was led as a response to destroy the slave system in the United States once and for all. Although the plan was a failure, and as a result, white slave owners placed stricter regulations onto slaves, and despite failing in efforts to destroy the slave system, the message was an outcry to all slaves across the US, with white slave owners struck with fear of what may happen to them. It's not until the events after the Civil War when slaves started to obtain more of their deserved freedom.
You guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Jim Crow laws were set in place to keep Black and white people from becoming allies and having any kind of social contact. Segregation laws included interracial marriage being illegal. There were separate rooms in schools, diners, pools, and healthcare settings. Anyone who wanted to protest or speak out were punished by having to pay a fine or even facing jail time. These laws unfortunately encouraged lynchings, and at which out of the 5,000 lynchings that had took place after segregation laws were put in place, 80% were committed in the southern states.
In the early 20th century, many African Americans began to migrate north in search of better jobs and treatment, which was not given to them in the slavery-stained South. They were confronted with resistance and prejudice from whites who used violence against them and tried to get them to stop moving into the same neighborhoods. Many African Americans eventually started moving to Harlem, New York, where there became a cultural renaissance where Black poets, artists, philosophers, authors, musicians, and intellectuals began creating new cultural expressions and exploring ideas about race. They also gained some respect from white people all around the country when jazz music began to gain popularity and authors and intellectuals and artists became more well known. They began to change perceptions of African American people and move away from the lazy, childish, dumb stereotypes and be seen with more respect as sophisticated and educated. This was a pivotal moment in history for Black Americans, but was unfortunately weakened by the Great Depression.
So is there a member who's going to be reviewing this slide?
I'll read the slide. W.E.B. Du Bois decided that they should consider voluntary segregation, the idea that Blacks come together and segregate themselves to build a Black economic nation within a nation, could have helped them stay financially stable during the Great Depression instead of having to rely on the government support that was not being given to them. It was, however, not executed. Scientologist Kelly Miller described the Black worker as the simplest man, the last to be hired and the first to be fired during the Great Depression, when there weren't enough jobs for everyone. Many tenants and property owners were growing in desperation, so they began to rent to more Blacks. The percentage of unemployment in African Americans was 30 to 60% higher than whites in many cities.
For years, African Americans protested racial discrimination and fought for equal rights. This was a civil rights movement that took place from the years 1954 till 1968. America claimed to be a country where everyone had equal rights. However, for decades, the United States had several segregation laws in place that physically separated Blacks from whites. The U.S. created divisions the best that they could for every public space they could think of, and also refused to give African Americans the basic right to vote and fair opportunities for employment. All of these went against their claim of a free country, which pushed African Americans to take action. Tired of being discriminated against, they began to engage in nonviolent acts of civil disobedience in order to attract attention to the issue. Making their voices heard with speeches and showing their strength in numbers during marches, they were able to succeed, and in 1964, the Civil Rights Act prohibited further public discrimination and encouraged integration.
Um, okay, so this is our cultural project. So we chose to do a mural, and our mural features pictures of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and other pictures from various civil rights protests. So the poem reads, "To be Black in America is to have a target on your back, living day in and day out, feeling unwanted and ready to snap, fighting for freedom and to be released from the shackles has created an eternal battle. It takes a lot of courage to fight. We want that better for the future generation and to have to stand up for what's right. You have to sacrifice when you're marching for your people. You might get beat if they hear you say we're all created equal. Our fallen angels made a choice to put their lives on the line and give us a voice. Decades of endless murder, oppression, and trauma to finally see a day where we have President Obama. And still, we must continue to fight."
Our oral history projects. I interviewed my grandmother and found out that I was half Honduran and my grandmother grew up poor and sold fruit on the street Sparkle. I interviewed my father and learned about the difficulties immigrants face when trying to make a living for themselves in a new country, Laura. I interviewed my father and learned that he was an immigrant coming from Nigeria to the United States and how he adapted to the new way of living and culture at Adana. I interviewed my grandfather and learned about his experiences with being African immigrant in the United States, Luisa. The person that I interviewed is my mother. I was able to learn my mother's experiences and how she overcome them. Her story inspired me because she made all her goals happen, Dulce. I interviewed my mother and I was able to learn about the harsh struggles of starting a family in the United States and an undocumented immigrant from Mexico, Darian. I interviewed my mother and I got to learn a lot about her experiences and how she was when she was my age. I learned about her first job, how she met my dad, challenges that she overcame, and much more. Adrian.
Wait, can I say mine?
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead. Yes, let's go back to the slide and you can go ahead and give your contribution.
All right, slide 4. Okay, so the Great Depression. The sociologist Kelly Miller described the Black worker as the surplus man, the last to be hired and the first to be fired during the Great Depression, when there weren't enough jobs for everyone. Many tenants and property owners were growing in desperation, so they began to rent more Blacks. Du Bois decided that they should consider voluntary segregation, the idea that Blacks should come together and segregate themselves to build a Black economic nation within a nation. Could have helped them stay financially stable during the Great Depression instead of having to rely on the government support that was not being given to them. It was, however, not executed. The percent of unemployment in African Americans was 30 to 60% higher than whites in many cities, and that could also be shown in the picture below. And then on the slide with the oral, the other slide, not, yeah. I interviewed my father and learned that he was an immigrant coming from Nigeria to the United States and how he adapted to the new way of living and culture. Adana.
All right, thank you so much, Adana. We appreciate it, and thank you to each and every one of you from this group. Thank you so much for your beauty, for I mean, it's incredible. I mean, every presentation is building more and more and more. So thank you so much for the contributions. We'll go ahead and we'll move on to our next group, and that will be the Caucasian American group. The Caucasian American group. So please make sure, folks, to mute yourselves. Only unmute yourself if you are one of our speakers, and we'll go ahead and hand it over.
Good morning, class. My group and I will be presenting on the Caucasian American topic. My name is Lily Dow.
My name is Jenny Hernandez.
My name is Natalie Ortega.
My name is Beth Pineda.
My name is Fidel Reyes.
My name is Veda Sarabu.
So I'm going to start off with the Irish history. I wanted to give a little background of it since we're talking about the Irish in America. So they had a lot of poverty and economic hardships in Ireland because of the British colonization. So they decided to immigrate to the land of promise. So during the 1815 through the 1845, 1 million of Irish immigrated to America. And after that group of immigrants came to America, the Great Famine occurred in 1855, and this caused for Irish to come another 1.5 million to immigrate into America. Once they got here, Irish worked on constructions of canals, railroads across the country, and other hazardous jobs with poor and dangerous conditions.
The Irish also faced a lot of poor treatment. For centuries, British laws had deprived Ireland's Catholics of their rights to worship, vote, speak their language, and own land, horses, and guns. Herded like livestock in the dark, cramped quarters, the Irish passengers lacked sufficient food and clean water. They choked on fetid air, they were showered by excrement and vomit while sailing to North America. Each adult was apportioned just 18 inches of bed space, children half that. When deceased, their bodies were wrapped in cloths, weighed down with stones, and tossed overboard to sleep forever on the bed of the ocean floor. The anti-Catholic, anti-Irish mobs in Philadelphia destroyed houses and torched churches in the deadly Bible riots of 1844.
Facing poor working conditions, low wages, and labor exploitation in the late 1980s, Irish workers in the show-making industry decided to organize a labor organization with the name of Secret Order of the Knights of St. Crispin. The main purpose of this organization was to demand higher wages and an 8-hour day schedule. However, they did not succeed, since after the first strike, they were fired and replaced with Chinese workers. Finally, after several years of suffering from constant humiliations from English Americans and living under poverty, Irish Americans at the beginning of the 20th century started to succeed in gaining recognition in the US. This is proven by the fact that only 90 of Irish American women work as servants by 19,000, compared to the 61% of Irish immigrants women who work in this position in previous years. Also, 40% of Irish Americans were hired in white-collar jobs in the early 1900s. Moreover, the percentage of Irish Americans that enter college increased, and a considerable amount of them were attending to Harvard. Finally, Irish Americans were gaining American citizenship, but this was due to them being white, since according to Anglo-Americans and Irish themselves, this made them automatically eligible to become Americans.
Under Israel's Law of Return 1950, as amended in 1970, all non-Israeli Jews and Gentile converts to Judaism are entitled to settle in Israel and receive full Israeli citizenship. Reform Judaism goes beyond Orthodox and conservative Judaism in affirming that child is Jewish if either one of the parents is a Jew. Judaism and the Jewish people have never been a monolith. It was during the Roman rule of Judea that Jewish communities began to take root in Europe, though the Italian Jewish community is thought to have begun in the city of Rome around 139 BCE.
A little bit about the treatment of the Jewish is that between 1933 and 1939, the Nazi had caused drastic changes in the social, economic, and communities of the German Jewish community. In 1939, only about 16% of Jewish individuals had employment of any kind. And also the most dramatic changes for the German Jewish community came with the World War II in Europe, in which Jewish authorities worked together to organize large amounts of Jewish immigration to support Jewish schools and organizations in order to end discriminatory legislation. About the Jewish resistance, Nazi-sponsored persecution and mass murder fueled resistance to the Germans in the Third Reich itself and throughout occupied Europe. Although Jews were the Nazis' primary victims, they too resisted Nazi oppression in a variety of ways, both collectively and as individuals. By 1941 and 1943, underground resistance movements developed in about 100 Jewish ghettos in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe. Their main goals were to organize uprising, break out of the ghetto, and join partisan units in the fight against the Germans. The Jews knew that uprising would not stop the Germans and that only a handful of fighters would succeed in escaping to join with partisans. Still, Jews resisted. Jewish prisoners succeeded in initiating resistance and uprising in some Nazi concentration camps and even in the killing centers of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz.
Same skin colors, separate naturalized countries, far away from their home country, they come to the land of the promise, some for survival or some for a better tomorrow. Stepping in the soil of the better tomorrow, they encounter what they were escaping by the ones that shared the same skin color. Sailing across the sea only brought us misery, denied our rights to Christianity, stripped of our rights to speak our language, own land, horses, and guns soon we had done. Misery had surrounded us as one, only by reminding them colonizers that they shared the same skin color did they give them a more suitable status in society.
So our group chose to do a spoken word on the cultural product. This is a piece that depicts experience and struggles of Caucasian immigrants, specifically how the Irish and the Jewish were mistreated and discriminated when they immigrated, and expected of this treatment because it was the same as their home country. Only by promoting their skin color did they gain a better treatment. The reason why we selected was because we felt that this was the best way to reflect our understanding and knowledge of the Jewish and Irish history, treatment, and resistance. Creating a poem allowed us to try a new form of artistic work.
So this is just basically like a summary of who we interviewed for our oral history project. I interviewed Rebecca Grigorian, a family friend. She's an Armenian immigrant who was born in Iran and moved because of the Iranian Revolution. She immigrated to the US at a young age with the rest of her extended family. Fidel interviewed Claudia Sales, his mother. She was born in San Salvador, El Salvador on February 27, 1980, 1 year after El Salvador's Civil War started. Throughout most of her childhood, she had to face the horrors of the Civil War and was forced to grow up at an early age in order to survive this cruel and brutal conflict. Beth interviewed Ruben Pineda, her father. He was born and raised in Jalisco, Mexico, and moved to the Los Angeles at the age of 16. He worked with different ethnic groups in restaurants, bakeries, and cafes. Natalie interviewed Teresa Gonzalez, her grandmother, who was born and raised in Jalisco, Mexico. She immigrated to Los Angeles, California at the age of 24, working for her family by cleaning homes. Lily interviewed Aladdin Del Lache, her grandfather, who was born and raised in Tehran, Iran, until moving to Alabama at the age of 21 and starting to attend university. Jenny interviewed Elvira Puente, a family friend, who was born and raised in Michoacán, Mexico, but later moved to San Francisco, California at the age of 19, working in restaurants and later grew a passion for cooking.
All right, excellent work, snaps, claps, all that good stuff. Wonderful, wonderful work. Thank you so much for this beautiful, beautiful presentation. All right, we are gonna hop quickly now into our next group, which is the Asian American group.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yep. Alrighty, so I guess I start. Hello, we are the Asian American group, and this is our PowerPoint for the History 2050 file. We'll start off with a brief history of Asian American immigration, and more specifically, their motivation and struggles with crossing the border. Many Asian Americans were enamored with the prospects of rebirth in a new world, with instability in their homeland encouraging them to immigrate. In the United States, new Asian American immigrants could satisfy the need for new laborers created by the Industrial Revolution. However, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act made it extremely hard for the Chinese to settle in America. They were eventually regarded as the first illegal immigrants and faced severe discrimination for their appearance and mannerisms. The Japanese suffered from harsh treatment as well. For instance, many couples were formed with the Japanese picture bride system. Middle-aged Japanese men would send pictures back to their homeland, where matchmakers would pair them with women they may have never even met. Then, the women immigrated to America under the conditions that they would marry their fiancés after stepping off the boat. Unfortunately, this system left many marriages dysfunctional and unhappy, contributing to the various barriers that Asian Americans had to overcome.
Now we will be summarizing the oppression that Asian Americans immigrants faced. One of these forms, which happened to be a common experience between all Asian Americans, was the mistreatment of laborers. Chinese immigrants were against harshly, with their search for jobs being referred to as the Yellow Peril. The working conditions of Japanese Americans were all documented as terrible, where they were given numbers to be referred to as instead of their names, and were known to work on the field from dusk till dawn every day. As for the Chinese, lower-class immigrants often weren't allowed inside America due to the exclusion laws, and women were looked down upon based on the stereotype that they were prostitutes. Japanese Americans, Japanese and unions formed to fight labor.
In the face of these abusive systems of power, acts of resistance and empowerment arise in Asian American history as well.
The Chinese Exclusion Act was a law passed in 1882 that prevented certain classes of Chinese immigrants from entering America. The Exclusion Act also prevented new Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens. For example, a Chinese laborer wasn't allowed to enter the U.S. because of their class. Laborers were not exempt from the exclusion laws like other classes. In order to combat these exclusion laws, Chinese immigrants would purchase false documentations from a Chinese American who had already become a U.S. citizen. They would then claim them as their child, which would allow the non-exempt immigrant to enter into the U.S. It still wasn't that easy. The two people involved would also often face interrogation by U.S. officials separately about personal details that a real father and child should know. The Chinese immigrants showed resistance against these laws, preventing them from coming to the U.S. in search of a better life by working together to find a loophole in the system. Many Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants also protested against these Chinese Exclusion Acts, which ultimately resulted in the Exclusion Acts being removed many years later in 1943.
Chinese immigrants also found ways to resist the immigration system even when confined on Angel Island. For example, notes on immigration proceedings and how to answer officials' questions would be put into food items and covertly delivered during mealtimes. Immigrants were able to cram entire messages into tiny peanut shells, demonstrating the undercover resistance against racist attempts at excluding them. This shows how resistance doesn't have to be directly opposing the system, but can also be circumvention and underground resistance. Another food item used was pork buns, an ethnically Chinese dish. This is especially ironic as it demonstrates how a piece of Chinese culture was used to resist attempts at eliminating Chinese culture from America. Legal or illegal, these acts of resistance prove the immense hope for a better life for themselves and their descendants, using their agency to resist racist attempts at exclusion and even helping others navigate the system.
The internment of Japanese Americans was ghost from the past that needed to be exorcised. Ex-internees had been silently carrying a burden of shame. During the 1970s, many third-generation Japanese Americans were feeling the need to break the silence. A growing sense of ethnic pride empowered them, seeking justice for their roots. They empowered their elders to tell the world the truth behind the internment experience, to eradicate the shame and stigma of the unjust internment of the 120,000 Japanese Americans. As the ex-internees had finally spoken, their voices persuaded lawmakers to redress the injustice of internment. In 1988, Congress passed a bill providing an apology and a payment of $20,000 to each of the survivors of the internment camps.
The product of their resistance can also be seen today, living on in their descendants. With our cultural product, a video displaying our cultural hobbies, we wanted to highlight the many unique Asian cultures that create the Asian identity. We wanted to also highlight how our Asian culture still lives on within us, even though we are a world away from our ethnic country.
Erica Lee once said, and I quote, "This racism was grounded into American ideology that homogenized Asia as one indistinguishable entity," end quote. Our cultural product is a compilation of my group's unique cultures that show just how diverse Asia really is. Asia is composed of a lot of small countries who have their own very unique heritage, unlike the common stereotype that Asia is just one big place where everyone's the same. Our cultural product demonstrates how this stereotype is wrong. Now let's begin.
This is a traditional Chinese folk dance called Aiyan Shuo, or Song of the Lotus. It portrays the lotus flower, a flower symbolizing purity and grace in China.
This is a dish called xian mian, or string noodles. Traditionally eaten on birthdays, its stringy noodles symbolize longevity in the Fujian province of China, another piece of the Asian culture in the United States.
The influence of Asia has also found its way into American gardens. Plants native to Asia, such as this tree olive shrub and kumquat tree, grow well in our Southern California climate.
Pagmamano is a common Filipino practice between family members used to greet elders when seeing them for the first time that day.
The song that I'm singing is a Farsi rendition of the American song, The Dove. It was written by Ahmad Zahid, who lived in Kabul, where my family was also originally from. This song in itself represents how American and Afghan cultures merge to form something unique.
According to Erica Lee, racism against Asian American was grounded in an American Orientalist ideology, which homogenized the many unique cultures into one large stereotyped identity. Our video refutes this ideology by displaying the many unique Asian cultures living on through us, passed on by our immigrant ancestors. Each one of the hobbies illustrated in the video demonstrates a way for us to connect back to our roots. We wanted to demonstrate that one doesn't have to choose between two countries, and it's possible to embrace both with an open heart. This act alone shapes our identity as not an Asian, not an American, but as an Asian American.
So let's take a look at how our own ancestors exemplified these characteristics. All throughout history, people of color have shown resilience and agency. For our oral history project, we all connected with someone we knew that displayed these traits. Take Christina's grandparents, for example. Despite getting forcibly displaced in their 20s by the Cultural Revolution, they built up their careers so that they were able to return to their hometown after 30 years. The rest of our ancestors also made stands against oppression and stereotyping, such as Sophie's grandmother fighting gender norms, my grandfather rising above poverty through the transformative experience of education. And though Justice's mother faced racism, her life goals went undeterred. Similarly, Selena's mother worked tirelessly to build her business from the ground up. And in the face of racism, Jason's grandmother exemplified agency with her perseverance in the medical field. And Zyrina's aunt worked hard despite discrimination, showing her drive to give her family a better life. This perseverance highlights the struggles our relatives faced in the past and the present, and how they showed agency throughout.
Thanks so much, everyone, for watching our presentation. We hope you enjoyed and that you learned something new.
Excellent. Snaps, claps, and all that good stuff. Beautiful, beautiful work. And I'm definitely going to want you folks to send that video, right, for us to maybe share that. So hopefully we can get that as an MP4. All right, let's go ahead and move to our last group, right, for presentation, and that's the Chicanx-Latinx Mexican American experience.
Can you guys see the screen? Okay.
Yeah, we can see the screen. All right. Good morning, everyone. Me and my group members are doing the Latinx presentation.
Latinx, a gender-neutral alternative to Latino or Latina, is a term that has been recently gained a presence in popular culture. The term is used to describe the diverse group of people who have roots in Latin America. Because the Spanish language classifies most words as masculine or feminine, the term Latinx emerged out of the act of solidarity to include LGBTQIA+ folks who may not have want to be classified as male or female. Latinx is an intersectional term that aims to include all people of Latin American descent.
Some important events that the Latin community had to go throughout the time are April 2, 1513, Spanish Ventura, I don't know how to say that. Ponce de Leon lands along the Florida coast in search of the Fountain of Youth, claiming the region in the name of the Spanish crown. And in 1846 to 1848, following America's conquest of Texas, a conflict over border control leads to the Mexican-American War. In August 2, 1942, the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement, also known as the Bracero, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, is signed by the United States and Mexico to avert labor shortage after the conflict. And in June 18, 2020, the Supreme Court has blocked the Trump administration effort to terminate the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
Latin influence. Everyone has a different way of telling stories. They can be from mouth to mouth, or written, or drawn. At the time, the school district largely ignored Mexican American history, and Chicano students were forbidden from speaking Spanish and often steered towards vocational careers instead of college, stated Robert J. Lopez in the CSULA magazine. This made many students feel ashamed of where they come from. But as the Latino and Chicano movement happened, the Latino community showed their love through murals all around Los Angeles. Each mural has a story behind them.
This is our cultural product.
Sorry, are we supposed to be listening to something or just looking at image slides?
There's an audio, but we don't know why it's not playing.
Is it maybe because Jaylene is muted? Is it playing off of Jaylene's?
America to South America and even Mexico. These countries all have many different lifestyles, which makes us so diverse. Being Hispanic.
Oh, did we lose Jaylene? We might have.
If you want, I can continue on. I'll share my screen.
Please, let me go ahead and make you a co-host. Okay, there you go. Hang in there, folks, while we are working through technical difficulties. We're still waiting for Karen's screen to share.
I'm so sorry.
Are there still a couple other slides that need to move on beyond the cultural product? Okay, we're on. Just want to let you know we don't have any.
We're just gonna continue with the other slides.
Okay.
Many students in the Latino community have very high dropout rates, so not many make it to college. So many just graduate from high school but never enroll into college. As in 2018, according to Cornell, the U.S. Department of Education National Center of Education, statistics said that 36 of the Latinos only enroll into college. Out of the 36 of the Latinos, according to PBS, 21% of the students only receive a degree. As a graduation rate, 35% of the Latinos graduate from a 2 to 4 year college. And even then, the gap between many communities and the Latino community is very low, as only 38 even graduate of a 2-year college.
Majority of Latinos are descended at least in part from indigenous cultures and have existed in the United States for generations. They are often portrayed as cultural parasites who have recently arrived. Men are portrayed as illiterate criminals. Women are depicted as being overly sexual. Both men and women are portrayed as unattractive, dirty, and lazy.
So for our oral history projects, Karen interviewed her mom, and she's from Guadalajara, Mexico. Aurel interviewed his mom, Juana, from Guerrero, Mexico. Jennifer interviewed her mother, Ilda, and she's from East Los Angeles. Guillermo chose to interview Eber Marquez, and he is from Zacatecas, Mexico. Crystal interviewed her father, Francisco, and he's from Guanajuato, Mexico. Me, Jaylene, I chose to interview my mom, and she's from Guatemala. Xiomara chose to interview her aunt, and she's from El Salvador. And Jennifer interviewed her mom, Ilda, and she's from East Los Angeles.
The book from class that we decided to use was A World of Its Own by Matt Garcia, because it talks about different cultures that helped make Los Angeles a diverse city. He talks about the Latinx community because of the way they developed in their arts. There was, in the 1920s through 1930s, there was a big change because it was no longer just labor jobs, it was performance jobs as well. Padilla Hills Theater is where they performed, and it lasted from 1931 to 1974. With this theater being hectic, it brought a lot of jobs, such as being a performer or a waitress or to be in the kitchen. This theater helped create a better understanding of what Mexican traditions there are and cultures to people who didn't know a lot about it.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much. Let's give snaps, claps, and all that good stuff. No worries on the video, right? You can always send me the link. You can also post a YouTube link in the chat for your colleagues in the class to also see, right? Thank you so much to each and every one of you, and not only in this group, but in all of the groups. As you can see, all of the wonderful research and perspectives, right, viewpoints and experiences that we are seeing, right, that's emerging. And I think every single group highlighted, right, so many interesting aspects of what's been happening, right, per group. And of course, we're not trying to homogenize everybody into one group, right, but you can see that there's a lot of diversity and a lot of unique experiences that we've been seeing, studying, examining throughout this semester, right? So thank you each and every one of you for the beautiful work that you've been putting into it.